So we know if we leave competitive markets alone, we get the efficient outcome. We get all surplus realized. All the gains that are out there are realized. So that's why we like markets, and we rely really heavily on markets to organize economic activity, to allocate resources in this economy. But we still do have a very significant government sector. And there's a variety of reasons for that. And what we're going to be doing in coming discussions here is talking about some of those reasons in significantly more detail. I just wanted to give you, this is just going to be sort of an intro to give you an idea of where we're going with this. The two I sort of put above the line because we're not really going to talk about these, but it's important just to touch on that the government provides a structure for markets to work, right? If we didn't have laws about private property, and if we didn't have court systems to enforce contracts, we really couldn't have markets. We really couldn't say, oh, I'll work for you and then you give me money at the end, but then I work for you and you don't give me money, and what do? Right? But because we have laws, because we have contracts, because we have private property and the means to enforce these laws, markets can work. In the absence of that structure, they wouldn't. And that's something that is worth pointing out because it's sort of obvious, but people sometimes, oh, big government, what do? Sometimes people forget about that part, that without some sort of organizing structure like that, it's really, really quite difficult for markets to work effectively. And then second is macroeconomic stabilization. So yeah, the government gets involved to increase GDP and to keep unemployment low and to keep inflation in check. We're not going to talk a lot about that, but if you took a macroeconomics class, you could learn some more about that. But so what I'm going to highlight below the line are some of the things that are more sort of relevant to what we've been talking about. And the idea, again, remember that people take action as long as the marginal benefits are greater than or equal to the marginal cost. But sometimes people don't have full information. So people may take action, but they may not know the actual true marginal benefits and marginal costs. So they may be taking action thinking that they're being rational, and they evaluate the marginal benefits and marginal costs and say it's worth it, not knowing full information. So you're smoking, saying, yay, this tastes great and I love the way it makes me smell, but you don't realize that it's going to kill you. You don't have full information on the marginal costs. And so sometimes the government gets involved and says, you have to, I don't know if that's showing up, but regulates information provision. The government says you have to tell people, you have to put warning labels on cigarettes and on alcohol, and you have to tell people, if their workplace conditions are unsafe, if there are hazardous materials in the workplace. You can't just pay them a little bit of money and hire them, but not tell them that the chemicals they're working with are toxic, right? You have to, so that people still might want to work with toxic chemicals, just like people will work in really dangerous jobs at the top of skyscrapers and things like that, but they have to know that there's a danger, and then you have to compensate them for it. But if they're working with these chemicals thinking they're not hazardous, and then they're not making a fully informed decision. And they might say, oh, if you want me to work with these, maybe I just won't do it, or maybe you need to pay me more. And so the government provides that information, or like with the nutrition information on food, or the calorie counts on the menus. It's just saying, here's the information. We're not going to tell you what to do, but we are going to make sure that you have full information so that we know when you're weighing the benefits and the cost, you're weighing the correct benefits and the costs. But sometimes we actually do step over that line of information provision and say, we've given you all the information and you're still not behaving the way that we think you should, so we're just going to tell you what to do. Like with seatbelts, right? You have to wear your seatbelt. We had ads and said, please wear your seatbelt. Here's a crash test dummy. Look what happens when they're not wearing their seatbelt. Look what happens. People still won't wear their seatbelts. And so finally we had to say, okay, it's a law. You have to wear your seatbelt. It's a law. We have to have airbags in our car. There's a lot of things that we have just passed as laws, because even if you put a lot of information out there about the marginal benefits and marginal costs, people may still not be fully informed or not really fully weighing them. And so sometimes the government just steps in and says, people really don't know enough or aren't being informed enough and making these decisions that are objectively bad for them. And so we're going to step in and tell them what to do. So sometimes the government does get involved to make sure that when you're making decisions, you're actually weighing the true marginal benefit and the marginal cost, trying to move you closer to the efficient outcome. And another case where the government tries to move us closer to the efficient outcome is in markets where we have imperfect competition. So I keep saying competitive markets. So if there's a whole bunch of firms and they're very competitive, so if one charges a really high price or isn't is not very trustworthy, you can just go somewhere else, right? But if there's only one firm in the market or very few firms in the market, that gives them a lot of power, and they can get away with raising price really high, keeping output lower, generating a less efficient outcome, decreasing your consumer surplus significantly. And so the government says, yeah, if we leave competitive markets alone, they're efficient and all that surplus gets realized. But a lot of times markets aren't competitive. And so we have laws. So we have antitrust laws. Antitrust, not that we're against trusting people, but antitrust is kind of like anti-monopoly. Like the Sherman Antitrust Act, the very first antitrust law, basically it was passed in 1890 and said any conspiracy, combination, or collusion and restraint of trade is illegal. I'm paraphrasing. And Article 2 of Sherman said any monopolization or attempt to monopolize an industry is illegal, right? It just says you have to be competitive. If the market's not behaving competitively, we can step in. And there's been a significant antitrust legislation since then. And so the government passes these laws and enforces them with different levels of rigor depending on what the administration in charge feels about them. But the idea is these laws are designed to encourage greater competition because we know competitive markets are efficient. So we leave the markets alone. We want to encourage them towards competition so that we get closer to the efficient outcome. So sometimes the government gets involved doing that. There's also, where am I at? 4. So I'll go up to 5. There are also some situations in which people might have full information, markets might be competitive, but there are a few specific situations that in economics we call them market failures. And market failures are when the market left alone fails to reach the efficient output. So usually we say, if a market's competitive, it will reach the efficient outcome. If people are fully informed and the market's competitive, you leave it alone, you get to the efficient outcome. That's usually true. But there are some cases where there may not be an information problem, there might not be a competition problem, but some specific types of goods for which the market left to its own devices may not actually be efficient or typically won't be efficient. And so there is a role for the government to step in and perhaps move the market closer to the efficient outcome. And we'll talk about both of these in greater detail. So I just want to put them here to sort of give you an outline of where we're going. So public goods and externalities. These are both specific types of goods. We mean something very specific when we say public goods in economics, and then goods that generate externalities. And we'll talk about these in more detail, saying, what is it about these goods and the markets for these goods that when you leave them alone, they're not efficient, and how can the government get involved to try to move these markets closer to efficiency? And so that's a lot of what the government does in getting involved in markets. And lastly, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but things fit in here, as we talked about with price floors and price ceilings, equity is an issue, right? So sometimes we get involved because we don't think the market outcome's fair. It may be efficient, but we say leaving the market to its own devices, we don't think it's fair. The distribution of income is too unequal, or we want to make sure that people can afford basic necessities even if they don't have valuable resources to provide to the labor market to get paid for that. So we might want some minimum standard of living or things like that. Again, equity is a normative concept. So there's not, universal agreement. It's not a positive statement. This is what's fair and this is what's not fair. But that said, we do still pass policies and develop programs based on some societal notion of equity, which we all don't agree on. This is where a lot of debate comes in, of course, but this is still a significant reason why the government does get involved in markets. So we'll talk some about that also. So there are sort of reasons. Yes, you leave competitive markets alone, but maybe they're efficient but they're not fair, or they may be competitive but still not be efficient in the case of market failures, or they may not be competitive, or they may be, but people may not have full information. So there are a variety of reasons. Again, these aren't exhaustive, but it's a pretty good overview of why the government gets involved. And so we'll talk more about specifically what these things are, what exactly the problem is, and what the government can do to improve on the situation in the market, to move us closer to an efficient and equitable outcome.